All right, I think it's recording, maybe. Does it say recording on your end?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Awesome. All right, so yeah, welcome everybody to today's remote huddle. We have Steph Smith with us today. I'm super excited to talk to her more about remote work, how she got into it, and then we're going to be diving into this bigger topic of how to find non-tech remote jobs, which is going to be super helpful for all of you to learn from and maybe even take some good takeaways and apply them to your current situation. Before we get started though, I did want to give a quick background on like why we're here and remote newbie in general. So remote newbie is around because I actually launched it back in October. After just being in remote work for a while and figuring out like there aren't as many resources as I thought there were to kind of take you from like zero to like finding a job. There's not like one place that you can go to and like just take all of those resources and apply them to your situation. So that's why I started Remote Newbie. And as part of that, I wanted to kind of bring the community together and every month or so bring on a guest like Steph, who's either been in the remote space for a while or has launched some sort of product that essentially solves problems for remote workers and has done a lot of research kind of in that space. So Steph Smith, she is a senior analyst at The Hustle, and she's working on their trends product right now, which is super cool. And she's also been working remote for a number of years. So I'm super excited to go ahead and dive into Steph's background. And if you could tell us, how you got into remote work, kind of just your overall background in tech, that'd be really great, a great place to start.
Sure. Yeah. So I've been working remotely, I guess, for almost around 4 years now, maybe a little less, but I used to work in consulting in a non-remote job. And I knew kind of immediately that that life was not for me. It was a pretty classic consulting job. I was working
Right.
50, 60-hour weeks and commuting 2 hours every day. And it wasn't so much that the actual work and the skills that I was using during that time were bad, but it was more so just like I felt like I could use my time more effectively. I felt like there was just a better option. So I spent most of that year, actually around 10 months or so, looking for remote jobs. So during that time period, kind of like tested different remote jobs out there, just whatever I could get my hands on. So I was doing a lot of part-time or contract work in anything from like social media to SEO. And then eventually finally found a job that I was like, okay, I'm happy to basically give up this consulting role to do this. And it was a growth marketing role at a company called TopTal, which was a fully remote company. So I did that for around a year and a half and then switched to lead their publications team for another year and a half. So I was at TopTal for around 3 years. And then just earlier this year, at the end of last year in September, I switched to The Hustle. So The Hustle is actually not a fully remote company or what some people would call a remote first company. But they do have some of their team remote, including myself. And yeah, I continue to work remotely in that role. So it's been really fun to kind of try a few different roles across the 3-4 years that I've been working remotely. But yeah, that's really, I guess, a little bit of an overview of what I've done over the last couple of years.
Awesome. So since you've been remote for a number of years now, how have you seen it kind of change from, I don't know, 4 years ago to now? Like, what are those big changes that you've seen or those big shifts?
Yeah, there's been so many changes over the last couple of years, and I think it's really exciting. A couple of the changes I've seen. One, I've noticed that back then when I was first looking for remote roles, there was very few out there, and they were only really at remote first companies. So companies like TopTal, companies that already understood what remote work was and really believed in it and were embracing it, within their companies. But it was very, very rare that you'd see a company like The Hustle that was actually in person and not remote first, even considering it. In fact, The Hustle only started really hiring people remotely in 2019. So that's a great example of like a company that previously was like kind of averse to remote work or maybe didn't understand it or hadn't been exposed to it in certain ways, that now is like all about remote work and is open to either trying it or even like really integrating it into their culture. And so that's one big change is that, 3-4 years ago, it seemed almost like a fad. And now I think people are recognizing that remote work isn't this thing that people want just to like work less or to travel the world or whatever. It's really just like a function of society, and flexibility and what people want to integrate into their lives. And it also is just a byproduct of the tooling and infrastructure that we now have available to us that enables people to work remotely effectively. The other thing that is tied to what I just said is just the amount of jobs that now can be done remotely is completely different as well. And it's really exciting. So back in the day, I remember when I was looking at remote job boards in it would have been 2015, 2016, all of them almost were developer jobs,
Right.
some design jobs. Even back then, very few marketing jobs, and I work in marketing, and I was really struggling even to find any sort of marketing roles out there. Whereas now there's tons of marketing roles, there's a lot of writing roles, product roles, and then even past that, there's starting to be roles that are, you know, contrary to what someone would assume can be done remotely. So like remote architect roles, remote lawyer roles, like
Therapists.
there's just like
Yeah.
exactly, there's like just like a way like wider breadth of what people
Right.
think can be done remotely. And really it's true that like probably in the last couple of years, some of those roles couldn't have been done remotely because there wasn't the right infrastructure and tooling, and now there is. So it's both a technology thing and like a perception thing that has shifted over the last couple of years. And it's really exciting because now it's not just, you know, a small subset of people who can work remotely, but like a really large amount of people, and that'll only continue evolving over time.
Yeah, for sure. I think what you mentioned about the infrastructure is super important too, because like I feel like nobody really talks about that a lot. Just
Yeah.
how much more accessibility we have, not only to obviously communicate and do our work in a remote setting, but then taking those jobs that like have been traditionally in person, right? Like the ones that you mentioned, and then now like being able to transition them over to some sort of remote environment. But it's all because of like the new infrastructure, and because people have been like creating that support for those roles, because if without it, really, like you would just keep going to the office, right? Like, so there's probably been key people to try and like push that to be more of a possibility, because yeah, I've seen like teaching roles online, therapist roles online. Yeah, it's crazy, but it's also like so great for those people, right? Because maybe they do perform better at home, and like, you know, they could provide folks with a better service if they are working in an environment that they're more comfortable in, or at the hours that they can, you know, they're the most productive at. So it's like a mixture of a bunch of things, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's what a lot of people miss. I think this is disappearing, but I think there's this perception that you know, people want to work remotely sometimes because they're lazy, or because like there's just this sense that like remote work is like this like kind of suboptimal solution sometimes, and sometimes it can be. But what I think people miss is that infrastructure piece, in that if we go back to like even like a very long time ago, when people used horses instead of cars, when cars showed up, people thought, you know, people were using cars are lazy and all this stuff. It's like a very similar thing, but it's like really there was just a better technological solution that was invented, and people should take advantage of that. And I could see remote work in a similar lens, that like there is this kind of like bias towards it. Still, it's fading, but people are opting for remote work just because of, you know, again, them being lazy, or them, you know, not wanting to commute and all this stuff. And it's like, well, those things are all true, but like, or like getting rid of the commute is true, but it's like really just a facet or a byproduct of this technology exists. So like, why not use it? If we went back 50 years and had this technology, remote work would have existed then instead of now. It's just a function of like, we now have the resources to actually enable this.
Exactly. Yep. Very true. And so you mentioned that you were looking for marketing roles back in the day, and you're finding it really hard to just find that remote role. How did you go? Like, can you take us through like your thought process in terms of like, how did you go about finding that remote job? It seems like you're already ready, right? You had some experience working in a remote setting through contract jobs. But you just knew that you like wanted to work remote because of like what reasons, if there are like, ones that you want to share. And then like once you said yes, let's work remote, what websites did you use to find those jobs? It might be different now because there's like so many. But yeah, if you could take us through that process, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I basically within a couple months of working in consulting knew I wanted to work remotely. The biggest driver at that time was just wanting to get rid of my commute and also wanting to like have control over where I was living. I was living in Toronto, which is where I grew up at the time, which I think Toronto is a great city, but I just didn't want to live there anymore. And so those were the two biggest drivers of me being like, I want to work remotely. Now I've kind of grown to appreciate that there's many more benefits of working remotely, like getting to work with driven people and getting to design your own schedule and all this stuff. But at the time, those were the two main drivers. So I basically knew I wanted to work remotely, but the one thing that I didn't want to kind of like sacrifice was like my career, if you want to label it as that. But I didn't want to just like give up what was a pretty good job at the time for like, completely throwing away any future prospects just so I could work remotely. And so my goal at the time was like, okay, let me find a job. It doesn't necessarily have to be in marketing, although that was the most like adjacent industry to consulting that offered some remote roles. So I was like, I need a role that like I can get excited about, where I'm actually like learning tangible, useful skills that I can see like a future career in. And so I started out and tried a bunch of different things. So I was applying to basically any role that I was thought could maybe, or any role that I thought I could maybe be hired in. So again, like SEO, social media, and I was trying different industries out or like sub industries out to see like, is this something that I can really see like a future in? And some of those were yes, and some of them were no. So like I did social media and I was like, this is decent, I can do it, but I don't really want to do this for my career. So ended up not doing that. And I was just applying to as many things as possible. So the sites I was using at the time were the same sites that I would recommend now, actually. So Remote OK and Flex Jobs. Remote OK is a free job board made by Peter Levels, who's pretty involved in the remote community. And then Flex Jobs, I'd say, is actually better, but it's paid. But I think it's something like 50, maybe slightly more dollars a year.
Okay.
So it's really like when you basically have the perspective that like paying $50 can get you a better job or several jobs. I actually found most of the paid work that I did at the time through Flex Jobs. I think it's like one of the best investments that you can make. And I think it also helps you get access to a variety of positions that, people who aren't willing to pay for that subscription are not applying to, versus if you are only staying on the free job boards. Man, there's so many people on those things these days. I think I was lucky because at the time less people knew about them, but you're basically competing with thousands of people on those free job boards, probably hundreds if you go to the paid ones. And so those are the two that I was applying with. And I didn't think about this as intentionally at the time, but I think it was something like unintentionally smart that I did, in that I got a bunch of experience working remotely through these side gigs. And I think a lot of companies these days who hire remote workers are looking for some sort of evidence that you can work remotely, that you can be self-directed, that you basically can do this, because some people are not as able to succeed in a remote environment. And so I didn't realize I was doing this at the time, but in getting a lot of those like side paid gigs, I think it really helped me in finally being able to secure that main position. So I would encourage people to really, experiment with some of these job boards or some of these opportunities. And I think a lot of companies these days, especially that offer remote work, are okay with you doing some sort of trial or some sort of test period, because they also want to make sure that you can do the role effectively. Exactly. And so I would really encourage people to, not necessarily have to dive 100% into something immediately, but really test the waters in different ways, whether it's different positions, different companies, and then use that as like as something to influence what you end up going into more full on in the
Right.
future.
Yeah. That's a good point. I think the experimentation piece is important as well. Even if you're able to do like you were doing consulting, right? Like some of most of that work was probably not, at a physical location. It was probably like maybe video calls or emails or, like other pieces of communication that weren't like face to face. So I always tell people like if you can experiment it in some way before you like find a full-time job that's remote, um,
Yeah.
that's good, right? Because then that way you figure out like what do you like about it, what do you don't like, and it also helps you out when you're applying to a job. They can see that you have had some sort of experience. Um,
Yeah. And I say this in some of my articles
yeah,
because of my personal experience, but like if you are in a job that can be done remotely,
right, right,
but isn't done remotely, you should ask if it can, like if your employer will allow you to do it remotely. And 4 years ago, I think most employers would say no. Now, I think people would be surprised at how many employers are actually okay with this because it is so much more of a normalized approach to work. And so, even 4 years ago, though, if you're good at your job, and I've grown to appreciate this even more because I led a team. If you're good at your job, people don't want to lose you,
yeah,
and in most cases, people would be much more willing to let you work remotely than to lose you entirely.
yeah,
And so if you're good at your job, um, and you're debating leaving because you want to work remotely, at least ask the question. Because what I ended up doing is look for roles for
hmm
10 months,
hmm
end up finding a job, accepting it, and then quitting, only to find out that my previous job would have let me
yeah,
actually work remotely instead of losing me. It ended up working out better for me because I'm happy I ended up going into tech and all
right,
this stuff.
right,
But if you
yeah,
do like your job and you're like, the only problem here is that I can't work remotely, just ask the question, because the worst thing that you'll hear is no, and then you can
exactly,
go on
yeah.
and switch anyway.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that because that's exactly what happened to me. I was working not at this company, but my previous company. I was like, I want to work remote. I want to work remote. And then I ended up like just asking, like you said, and didn't ended up working out, right? Like, didn't want to lose somebody who was valuable to the team. So it was like,
Yeah.
yeah, we'll experiment with it for let's say like 3 months, and if it all goes good, which usually it will, unless you end up hating remote work,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And so it did, and that's how I got started with remote work in general. So I think it's super valid what you're saying, and I think more people should have that mindset over it being like I have to jump ship if I want to work
Yeah.
remote. But if you let's say you do want to jump ship because you like don't like your job, when you think about remote jobs, a lot of them are technical, like you said. For the most part, a lot of the ones I see, right, they're a little bit technical. But there are a few that come in that are at tech companies, but they're not necessarily on the development team or on um, maybe even sometimes the product team, right?
Mhm.
Those other kind of verticals that don't require you to have like a technical background. How would you recommend folks go about finding those jobs? Is there like a specific strategy that you have for finding jobs that are non-technical but also remote?
Yeah, so I wrote an article about this. So if people just search like non-technical remote jobs, you'll probably find my article. But I would say I have a couple tips. So one, you can just go to the job boards, the ones that I mentioned. But again, you will be competing against thousands of people these days who are applying to those same jobs. And many of those people will have already have experience working remotely. And so it'll be it's not impossible. Still look in those job boards, but it's very hard these days to, I think, get a job in remote work if you don't have any experience in it prior, especially if you're looking for those non-technical jobs, because just like the supply demand ratios are much less in your favor versus if you're like a developer, for example. However, some tips that I give are a lot of these companies there's an increasing number of companies that are remote first companies. And TopTal was one of them, but there's literally dozens. And if you just search like remote first companies, you'll find many sites that have like aggregated full lists of these. A lot of these companies have these non-technical roles like HR, like some sort of blog or content team, And they hire remotely because they're remote first companies. And often you actually just, I'm not even sure why these mechanics are the way they are, but many of these jobs are not posted on these job boards. They miss them for whatever reason, or maybe the company just hasn't outwardly posted them. But if you actually go either onto these companies' careers pages or just reach out to them directly for whatever reason, I think you'll have a much better, from my experience, opportunity or likelihood of getting a job there, especially if there's like a particular reason that you want to work at that company. We, for example, in the article that I wrote, TopTel has at any excuse me, given time, literally dozens of roles open. Some of those roles are technical, but many of them are not. And if you actually go to any of the job boards that I mentioned, only a handful at any given time are actually posted there. So instead, take the initiative and actually identify companies that you want to work for, ideally remote first companies, and then reach out to them to actually see if there's roles open in the particular areas that you're interested in. I would also say the best way to find a job, and this is not easy, the best way to find a job is have people reach out to you. And the best way to do that is actually take your skills and create something online that that draws attention. So for example, my current job, I actually found through basically writing articles, those articles getting attention, and then Sam, the founder of The Hustle, finding me and reaching out to me. And so I'm not saying it's easy. I think there was a lot of luck involved there. But if you do have particular skills that you think you're very good at that you could be hired for, the best way to get people's attention is to actually get them to appreciate your work first, versus you cold applying to jobs and then hoping that they'll like what you do, or hoping that they'll actually give you the time of day. So those are a couple tips that I would say in trying to find especially these non-tech remote jobs, because they are, again, that supply demand ratio is more difficult, especially these days with so many people wanting to work remotely. So I would actually say stay away from the job boards and actually use your skills to identify companies that you want to work for, and or get people to actually find you in some way.
Awesome. And I think in your article you also mentioned maybe potentially if you wanted to learning a new skill, I guess to be able to apply to those more technical roles. Would you say that that's something that you would do maybe if you're not really having a lot of luck with the role that you're looking for that's non-technical? It's learning that new skill, you could potentially have a broader search, right? You're kind of opening a lot more doors by learning maybe some sort of technical skill to help you out during that search process.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one thing, and this ties into what I was saying about infrastructure changes.
Yeah.
The workforce is becoming more technical.
Yeah.
And so if you want to work remotely, you don't necessarily need to learn to code, or you don't need to be extremely digitally inclined, but the more that you are, the more successful I think you'll be with remote work, or at least the easier time you'll have in kind of getting accustomed to it. And like you said, the more digital skills that you have, the wider net you're casting for types of remote roles that you can actually get involved with. And I think one key thing with remote work, which I've found, is any role where you work remotely tends to be pretty dynamic, especially in marketing type roles. You're very rarely going to be hired as an email marketing specialist that only focus on one particular subset of the marketing stack. You're probably going to be hired as some sort of maybe one type of marketer, but you're going to be involved in various different aspects of marketing, likely product, in which case you should have some sort of at least basic understanding of design and development. Mm-hmm. And what I'm getting at is basically remote work is super dynamic. I'd say most companies or jobs that are involved with remote work are on the end of innovation that's constantly moving. And so if you do want to get involved with remote work, but you're very, very rigid in your skill set, you probably won't succeed as well, because you won't be able to almost like keep up with the changes that are happening in the space. And so not just in casting a wider net, but being able to like almost be more successful in your role, I would kind of encourage people to learn digital skills. Again, you don't necessarily need to like become a developer. You don't need to like understand SEO to an extent where you could be hired for it. But like, I think I mentioned in this article, if not this one, another one, there's like kind of baseline skills that will help you in any digital role. Those are things like a basic understanding of design, basic understanding of data analytics, basic understanding of like development, or at least like the way a browser works, for example. And as you learn those things, like you will not only be more hireable, but you will be able to learn things in the digital space, and that'll serve you for like years and years to come.
Yeah. Really great advice. Yeah, thank you for diving into that. That was awesome. And then, yeah, we're kind of at the end of this remote huddle in general. I did want to give you, Steph, a chance to, if you want to share your, I know you do a lot of writing that would love for folks to check out. Yeah, would love to kind of give you a chance to let folks know where to find you.
Yeah, so you can find me at my site, which is like there, so stephsmith.io.
The link here.
Perfect. Yeah, so that's my homepage. I write pretty actively at my blog, which is blog.stephsmith.io. So I write about topics, remote work being one of them, also other things like continuous growth or tech. And I think in general, if you find remote work interesting, it does permeate some of these other topics, or it deeply connects with those topics. And then you can also find me on Twitter, and my handle is StephSmithIO. But yeah, feel free to reach out if you have any questions about remote work. It's something that I love seeing other people get into, so long as it's for the right reasons. And yeah, so if you want to reach out, you can email me or DM me on Twitter, and I'll definitely be happy to respond.
Sweet. And since I will be uploading this to YouTube, I will make sure to put all of your links in the description. So if anybody wants to connect with you, they can. And yeah, if you're watching this as a recording, feel free to reach out to Steph. Feel free to, if you want to reach out to me as well with any questions or feedback for future topics, feel free to let me know. And yeah, I'll go ahead and send us off. Thank you so much for joining.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
All right, cool.